Since then, Jeff has gone on to do many other notable things and as a esteemed professional in agriculture and natural resource management. He presently is a professor at James Cook University and holds a number of roles on commissions, and I can't keep it all straight, but Jeff's worth listening to about landscapes, and I've learned a tremendous amount of by working with Jeff on this whole idea of integrated landscape thinking. So welcome, Jeff. Good to have you here.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Louise. I actually first met Louise, it must have been in the mid-1980s, when we went to the Uzambara Mountains in Tanzania with a very prestigious team of international scientists to design the ultimate integrated conservation and development project, real state-of-the-art stuff. And we've both been trying to do that ever since, and we still haven't quite made it. So I'm going to just say a few things, 10 minutes on some of the issues around this whole landscape approach, and I'm going to divide my presentation into two parts. First of all, why we need to do it, and secondly, a few thoughts on how we might want to do it. So the why is that, as FAO tells us, we're going to need to produce at least 70% more food by 2050. We're also going to produce a lot more from land. We're going to produce a lot of fiber, and we're probably going to replace a lot of the chemicals that we get from fossil fuels by things we grow on potentially agricultural land, so things like oil palm and so forth. So there's a huge challenge to increase the productivity or the production of the world's lands. Now, some of this increased production is certainly going to be achieved through increasing yields. There are huge gaps between what is achievable and what is being achieved throughout the world, so we can do a lot by simply applying better agronomy and better crop varieties and so forth. There are huge gains to be made by wasting less. A lot of the food we produce is eaten by rats and mice and insects. In the rich world, we throw half of it away, so we can make huge progress there. And we could also make a huge difference if we didn't all eat meat, if we were prepared to eat vegetables and beans and things. We could go a long way to contributing to this food crisis that we're all concerned about. But even if you do all of those things, the pressures of our increased and more prosperous world population are going to be so great that whatever happens is inescapable reality. There's going to be enormous pressure on land. And a lot more land is going to have to be used for different sorts of agriculture broadly. Now, all that land is going to mean less nature. So the pressures on wild nature, on forests and wetlands and grasslands, are going to be very, very severe. And maybe people are saying, I'm saying, that the biggest threat to nature and biodiversity in the coming decades is going to be from this expansion of agriculture and intensification of agriculture. So everybody sort of agrees on that, I think. But as soon as you get beyond that point, there are very fundamental disagreements amongst different people about how you achieve these things. So there is a sort of conventional economist World Bank view that the answer lies in industrial agriculture as practiced in Europe and North America, Australia, where you produce a heck of a lot more on a smaller area of land and you save a lot of nature. You just don't need to convert nature. So that's one extreme view. There's another extreme view, which is that we could all be a lot better off by going for locally self-sufficient, biodiverse farms with lots of trees and perennials and things. And this is a view that's expounded by UNEP. And then there's a complete range of views across the spectrum between those two. I don't propose to get into that now. There's a lot written about this. But I think my take on this is that there is not a single solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's not, the answer's not going to lie at either end of those extremes. It's going to lie at different points along that continuum, and the answers will be different in different parts of the world, depending on all sorts of contextual elements. So, there will be some places where this very segregated sort of landscape with intensification is going to be the answer. There will be other places where more integrated, local, self-sufficient solutions will be the answer. Anyway, whatever happens, there is going to be integration, greater contact, like interface between agriculture and nature in the future. And whether the scale of integration is very fine or very coarse, we're going to have to work out how to achieve optimal outcomes in places that we care about. So there's been a recognition of this sort of thing for a decade or so, and almost all the international conservation organizations are now launching into what they call landscape approaches. They all have landscape programs which are aspiring to solve the problems of rural poverty and food security, and at the same time save nature and environmental values. And this has perhaps become the predominant paradigm, if you like, of international conservation action in the last decade or so. It's attracting an awful lot of money. And a group of us, Eco-Agriculture Partners, IUCN and others, wanted to understand better how these things were working, whether they were working, what lessons we could draw from them all. So this comes to the second part of my presentation, which is how this can be done. So what we did, a group of people, C4 was prominent in this, was to review a lot of these landscape approaches, read a lot of the literature. We convened workshops in Africa and Asia to examine landscape approaches and get together with people who were practicing them. And we distilled out a bunch of best practices. We then consulted widely on those best practices, got the views of people. We also did an online questionnaire, a survey monkey thing that we sent out to hundreds of people who we thought might be interested, thousands of people in fact, and we got quite a lot of responses. We had questions about what people were doing, what was working, what was not working, what they saw as the obstacles, and what they saw as the solutions. And that was quite revealing. What we really concluded was that there was no landscape approach. For ecosystem approaches, we have various sets of guidelines and principles and things like that. For landscape approaches, that wasn't the case. People are using this term in very different ways, in very different situations, and there is no methodology that is applied. We thought, in fact, that it's, the term is being used in what Henry Kissinger referred to as a constructively ambiguous way. It sort of carried this message that we're going to solve all the world's problems by integrating everything at the so-called landscape scales, but nobody was quite sure how you were going to do that, or even how you'd know if you succeeded in doing it, because nobody would seem to be measuring these things in any way that gave you an overall view of the outcomes of the interventions they were making. We reviewed in quite a lot more detail a whole lot of these integrated landscape type projects in the lower Mekong, and on Sunday night we're going to launch, or Monday night, a book that we have written on this called Evidence-Based Conservation. But one of the conclusions of that book was that the evidence was pretty dodgy, pretty shaky, but often there was not a lot of evidence, there were a lot of assertions and claims, but when you look very closely, people had a lot of trouble proving that what they'd done was producing better outcomes than some other things they might have done. Anyway, having said that, we did manage to distill out of all these studies and reviews and things some principles that people were applying. And we have recently got together in a small meeting with all those different organizations that I mentioned, and we've drafted a paper which is about to be published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which does set out principles for landscape approaches. And those principles have already been through the subster of the Convention on Biodiversity, and they're going to be presented to the conference of the parties of the Convention on Biodiversity in Hyderabad next month. And we hope they might receive some sort of tacit stamp of approval, and they might become, in a sense, a sort of sequel to the ecosystem approach principles that the CCD approved a few years ago. So I'm going to tell you what our main conclusions were on those principles. Although I think I have to preface that by saying that what we observe is that in reality, human societies have already been doing this for a long time. But there are all sorts of things, social things that people do that go beyond the little plot of land they own. People are always aware of their surroundings. They have the whole sort of civilization, the whole organization of communities and societies has as one of its main functions to deal with the landscape, with the joined up nature of all the issues that people are confronting. So people might farm one plot, they're harvesting trees from another bit of community-owned land, and all sorts of things like that are going on. So I think there's a little bit of a tendency to ignore the fact that societies have done so much and so well for a long time, the same time, the conditions are changing so rapidly, the pressures are increasing so rapidly. New areas are being opened up by infrastructure, populations are increasing, demands are increasing, that probably the traditional arrangements for dealing with landscapes are being overtaken by events. They're not going to work very well over the next few decades. And superimposed upon all the pressures is, of course, the additional pressure from climate change, which is going to make things much more complicated. So anyway, we don't think we have a magic solution. What we really, I think, have found is that it's much more difficult to do this than people thought. That these organizations that have decided to pursue landscape approaches ambitiously in developing countries mainly, which has been our main focus, have often been rather naive about their ability to change landscapes. A landscape is the product of the decisions of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, depending on the scale at which you operate. If you want to change the trajectory of change of those landscapes, you have to influence many, many individual decisions, and that's a very difficult thing to do. So, to cut a long story short, the 10 principles that we came up with as a part of this review of what people are doing and are claiming is fairly successful are the following. The first is that there has to be a process of continued learning and adaptation. That the goalposts are moving. People cannot just carry on doing what they're doing now. They have to constantly be changing. So the nature of the landscape will change over time as the demands change and the pressures change. And so you have to have some sort of process in place where people can exchange information and take decisions collectively and change their management. And that's a difficult thing to do. The second principle is that there has to be some common shared entry point. And that's also difficult because in many cases people have quite contrasting, vigorously held views on what the outcome should be. People do not necessarily agree. So this harks back a bit to the very famous book by Kai Lee from the early 90s called Compass and Gyroscope. You have to have some distant vision that everybody can agree they want to get to, even if it's a little bit vague. But how you get there is very uncertain. You have to sort of navigate your way through all the complexity of these systems. The third principle is that there are different things happening at different scales. And so something that sort of works at a very local, on-farm scale may be eclipsed by some macroeconomic change, changes in exchange rates or markets or things like that. So you have to not do these things at any one scale. You have to understand and introduce into the discourse issues that are occurring at lots of scales. And that's often something that is very difficult for instance, rural people in developing countries to do, because they've never had to do that before. Then the next principle was multifunctionality, that these landscapes have to provide lots of different functions, and there are trade-offs between those different functions. And there are losers and winners in this whole multifunctionality debate. And getting agreement on which functions predominate at any one time is difficult. There are policy issues here, there are incentive issues and payment issues. Enormous efforts in the European Union to actually codify this and finance this is difficult. The next one is that there has to be some sort of logic of change. This is the buzzword at this conference. You have to have a theory of how these things might change. It has to be plausible and convincing for the stakeholders involved. How would you set about causing some sort of change to occur? Would it be through payments for environmental services or RED or simple regulation? Difficult things, but it has to be there. The next one is that there have to be rights and responsibilities clarified. People have to know who owns what, who has the right to what, who has access to resources. If this is very unclear, which it often is in many developing country situations, then you have problems. So getting all those land right issues sorted out is very important. The next thing is that assuming you get through all those stages, there has to be some way of measuring how you're getting on. And that has to involve people, and it has to be reasonably user-friendly. So you have to have in place some way of measuring the progress you're making in getting a landscape that meets everybody's needs as far as it's possible to do so. And there are some good examples of where that's worked quite well. The next one is resilience, and I'm really unsure what to say about this, because it's another word that seems to be thrown out very casually by everybody. There are assumptions that we know how to make these systems resilient, and that we can measure resilience, and yet the sort of rigorous literature suggests that that's a very difficult challenge. So obviously these landscapes that we are working in will have to resist shocks from the outside, changes that we may not have predicted. And there have to be social structures in place and biophysical elements in place that will enable them to do that. So that's a big challenge for research and for practitioners where we need to do a lot more work. And the last one is perhaps self-evident from all the others, that to do all of this, you need stakeholders who have a lot more capacity. So that capacity can come through education, skills, having the assets necessary, having the rights to the land and so forth. So those are our 10 principles, and the paper will probably go online within 6 weeks to a couple of months, and about 4 or 5 of the authors are in the room here, so they may accuse me of misrepresenting what we said. That's a very simple version of it. Anyway, I'm going to sort of leave you with these thoughts and say that I'm fascinated to hear what the different speakers have to say about these issues, because I think the conservation community as a whole has sort of opened a can of worms here. It's set up this paradigm, this landscape approach paradigm, without properly thinking through what it was going to do and how it was going to do it, and without having put into place mechanisms for knowing whether it succeeded or not. And I think the last one is a really important thing that we have to do, focus a lot of attention on. If we're going to invest millions of dollars over long periods of time in doing these things, then we have to set up some sort of objective system for measuring our success. And probably that also involves measuring what happens in a place where we don't do it, so that we've got a counterfactual situation, which is something we don't do very often. And I think there are major challenges there. And of course, success is not a fixed end point. That's the problem, but change is going to carry on forever. So it's staying